book of Canadian foreign policy really is an outline of the history of this country's foreign policy, which is not the foreign policy that most of us are taught, that we believe of this country as a force for good in the world. Canadians have the highest self-appraisal of their country's role in the world, despite a long history of Canada supporting imperial wars, from the British War in Sudan in 1885 to the British War in South Africa, the Boer War of 1898, to the First World War, to Korea in 1950 to 1953, where 4 million people were killed, to Canada's role in bombing the former Yugoslavia, Serbia in 1999, to today in Afghanistan, where as many or more than 3,000 Canadian troops are involved in a brutal war of aggression, occupation of Afghanistan. And this is just part, the militaristic, the active involvement, Canada's active military involvement in these wars, just part of a broader Canadian foreign policy that's about supporting empire and supporting Canadian corporate investments abroad. You have Canadian support in a number of ways to the U.S. war in Vietnam, Canada's role, military invasion of Haiti in February of 2004, Canada's support for Israel's brutal bombing of Gaza at the end of, in December of last year, January of this year, Canada's quiet or secret involvement in the U.S. Invasion of Iraq and occupation of Iraq. We did win a big victory, or we won a victory as a peace movement in terms of stopping the Canadian government from officially participating in the coalition of the willing. But our government, the Chrétien government, behind our backs, did what they could to support the U.S. war in Iraq, and actually continue to support the U.S. war in Iraq. So I think it's a question of what do we want as a Canadian populace. I think the majority of Canadians certainly believe that Canada is a force for good in the world. I think, unfortunately, that is not the reality. But I think that most Canadians want our country to be a force for good in the world, want this country to represent the majority of the Canadian population's interests abroad, not just representing the interests of the foreign policy establishment, the military contractors, the generals, the mining companies, the banks, and a handful of politicians. I think the majority of Canadians want to see a change to Canadian foreign policy. If you look at polls about Canada's role in Afghanistan, it's an unprecedented opposition in the history of Canadian foreign policy. There's never been more Canadians opposed to a Canadian foreign policy endeavor than there is today against Canada's presence in Afghanistan. 55, 60% or more of the population wants Canadian troops to be brought home. So I have a few propositions about what we need to do to have a more just Canadian foreign policy. One, right off the bat, we need to get rid of the Joint Task Force 2 Canadian Special Forces commandos that are involved in these nighttime raids in Afghanistan, where they bust through people's doors, demanding to see supposed Taliban, whether it's family members, whether it is actual Taliban, or whether it just happens to be people who are living in the wrong house, get victimized at night, oftentimes being assassinated by Canadian and U.S. Special Operations Forces. So I think we should be calling for the abolition of Canadian Special Forces commandos that can be that are used abroad without any, in total secrecy. The government has said that the actual precise reason for having these special forces is to have this secrecy, so they don't have to tell the Canadian public what's going on. Also, I think we need Canada to pull out of NATO immediately. if NATO ever had a use, which I'm a little bit doubtful of, but if it ever had a use, that use is definitely gone since the end of the Cold War. Canada's military budget. The Harper government last year, about 1 year ago, announced a 20-year program to spend $490 billion. That's right, $490 billion on the military over the next 20 years. Despite the Harper government's plans, numerous studies show that Canadians put spending on the military far down on the list of priorities, way after education, healthcare, social housing, etc. So I think instead of ramping up the military budget, we should talk about reducing the Canadian military budget by 10% a year for the next 5 to 10 years, with the ultimate aim of basically eliminating the current Canadian military. We need to bring the troops home now from Afghanistan, not in 2011. Today, the Harper government's playing a game. They're actually ramping up Canadian troop levels in Afghanistan. When they announced the pullout of 2011, there was about 2,200 Canadian troops in Afghanistan. Today, there is more than 3,000 Canadian troops, with plans to add 800 more beds at the Canadian base in Kandahar. There's talk about increasing that number to 4,000 Canadian troops in Afghanistan. And what the Harper government wants to do is move Canadian troops from Kandahar post-2011 to other parts of the country, to Kabul or elsewhere in the country. So I think we have to call for bringing the Canadian troops home now. And finally, I think the major point of what our demand should be about Canadian foreign policy, about militarism, is enough of this country's role in the world being defined by a small elite of corporations that profit off of militarism, of generals that benefit from sending troops abroad, of Canadian banks and mining interests that profit from exploiting the global south. Enough of a Canadian foreign policy defined by elite interests in this country, by the big corporations, and we want a Canadian foreign policy that represents the interests of the majority of Canadians, and we want that foreign policy now. And the point of this demonstration and our role here for the weeks and months and years upcoming is to do what we can as individuals to build a movement in this country that demands that Canadian foreign policy represent our interests, democratic interests, not the interests of the elite. Thank you very much.